I'd like to welcome everyone back to Strand A of the 2021 SciAccess Conference. We will now be joined by Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai, who is the Chief Accessibility Officer of the Canadian National Institute of the Blind, and his co-presenter Ainsley Latour, who is a scientist and educator specializing in access for all. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be speaking.
Thank you so much for having us. It's Mahadeo. Ainsley, I'm going to go ahead and share screen.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, you're ready to go.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Ainsley Latour, and the title of our talk is Unconscious Bias in STEM Education, Training and Research, How to Recognize It and What to Do About it. And this is presented by myself, Ainsley I. Latour, MLT, MSc, and Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai, middle initial A, PhD at SciAccess 2021. The slide deck that we are using has a purple background for the most part. The other slides after this will have a purple title bar and with the IDEA STEM logo. So the IDEA STEM logo is the text, IDEA-STEM, and that's underneath 3 hexagons, which are stacked in a group. Mahadeo, can you advance the slides? So about myself, I am someone who identifies with she, her, and hers pronouns. I have a master's in evolutionary genetics. I practice as a clinical genetic technologist in healthcare and human genetics, and I'm a research consultant. So there's a photo of me on the screen. It is of me standing against a brick wall. I have long brown hair in the photo, which is down. I'm wearing a white blouse with a black jacket and a necklace. So today I'm actually coming to you from my home office. I'm wearing a black jacket with a blouse that has flowers on it, a necklace, pink glasses, a pink cochlear implant, and my hair is back in a ponytail. Thank you.
And hi, everybody. It's Mahadeo again. So I go by he, him, and his pronouns. I have a PhD in medical biophysics from the University of Toronto. I have 2 postdocs in cancer genomics and experimental therapeutics. I am, along with Ainsley, co-founder of IDEA STEM. I'm also co-founder and secretary of the International Network of Researchers with Visual Impairments and Their Allies, or INOVA. I'm the Director of Research and Chief Inclusion and Accessibility Officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and I'm an assistant professor adjunct in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Queen's University. The photo of me on the right-hand side of the slide shows me against one of those sort of typical professional photo backgrounds, and my hands are on a pedestal. I'm wearing a gray suit with a green shirt and a green and gray tie, and I'm a brown-skinned male, mostly black hair, what little there is left of it, and I wear very thick glasses. I'm actually wearing exactly the same shirt for today's presentation as I wore in this photo. I just realized that, but I have a dark blue blazer on, and I'm standing against a blurry background of my home office. Ainsley, over to you.
Thanks, Mahadeo. So just before the learning objectives, I want to quickly acknowledge that Mahadeo and I are delivering this presentation to all of you from the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe in Kingston, Ontario, which is part of historically Turtle Island. I identify as a socialized white settler, but I do have an Indigenous background. So the learning objectives for today are threefold. The first one is to understand the origins and negative impacts of unconscious biases towards disability. The second one is to understand and recognize and also counter unconscious bias in self, peers, and colleagues. And the third thing we're going to do is present a couple of tiny case studies within this session. And we're hoping that'll help you to apply the principles learned in this session earlier on to accessibility in STEM work. So before we talk about unconscious bias and as it relates to disability and accessibility in STEM, I actually just want to talk generally about unconscious bias for a few seconds. And I would like us to consider the statement, all ducks lay eggs. For the most part, people accept this statement as true, but in fact, it is not. older ducks, baby ducks, ducks that have the wrong reproductive parts for egg laying, they actually don't lay eggs. And so there are many ducks that don't lay eggs. And so I put this in here to illustrate that humans really do think in categories. It's a historical or evolutionary practice that we have that helps us understand the environment around us. And so we all have unconscious bias, and doing this work where you're trying to counter and correct unconscious bias to open up opportunities for any underserved community. Really, the first step is that we have to accept that we all have unconscious bias. We may think that we're all not ableist or we're all anti-racist, but in fact, there are moments in each day, in each year, in each week, where we do actually act and think in ways that would be considered racist or ableist. And that's a really uncomfortable thing, to be told that we have ways of thinking or potentially are actionable on those negative ways of thinking that could hurt somebody. That's a really hard thing to confront. But it's really important that we do that in ourselves before we can start to confront unconscious bias in other people. Mahadeo? So we're going to talk a little bit about in this talk what unconscious bias actually looks like. So we see unconscious bias comes out in attitudes. So the attitudes of ourself and our self-talk that we use to talk to ourselves, but also in the attitudes of others. And we're going to talk a little bit how those attitudes of others that are guided by unconscious bias actually shape course requirements in STEM, course content, how that course content is delivered, and how the skills must be demonstrated or how they need to be assessed and evaluated. It shapes expectations for students in the student supervisor or student instructor or student faculty relationship. And generally, we can understand that a lot of unconscious bias is hard to see. And one of the reasons why it's difficult to see is because it's actually disguised as helping behavior that benefits the dominant group, rather than exclusionary behavior towards that marginalized community, which we also see. Mahadeo?
So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of unconscious biases that people may have, and how those unconscious biases sort of rear their heads. And unconscious biases will become evident through attitudes that people will have. And so we can find unconscious biases in faculty and our educators through things like gatekeeping. So for example, you don't have the ability to do science. You can't have accommodations in science profession of choice or in your work. You don't need to learn science. You don't need to do this lab experiment. And the ever popular question, why are you here? But we as students can also have unconscious biases that show up in attitudes around trailblazing, around the sense that, well, you know what, I'm the first person to get here, therefore I must be the first person to actually be here. Or I don't have the ability to do science, or I don't have to learn science because somebody tells me I don't have to learn science, or I can't do this lab experiment, or the imposter syndrome question, why am I here? The other thing that we have to think about in the context of how our attitudes sort of come to the fore is something that I'm calling ism blindness versus ism awareness. And so ism blindness goes something like this: I don't see color, I don't see ability, I don't see gender. And on the surface, it sounds very much like it's the right thing to do, right? Effectively, it's saying, what I care most about is what you can do. I don't care, and this is how it comes across. I don't care about who you are. I care about what you can do. And so this is a very 1990s, early 2000s thing. It's an attempt to not be biased by a person's lived experience. And the idea is it treats everybody equally. It treats everybody the same. The problem is it also doesn't take into account that lived experience. And as we all know, that lived experience absolutely matters. This is a very politically correct 1990s, early 2000s thing. And today, in the world that we live in with the Indigenous racism issues that have come to the fore, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and with all of the other issues around inclusion and intersection identity that are coming to the fore, ism blindness has become supplanted with something that we call ism awareness, which is I recognize the totality of your lived experience, and the totality of your lived experience absolutely matters. On the surface, it's the harder thing to do, but it is a recognition that it's not possible to take a person out of context. And it really invites us to check all of our biases. I've had a number of conversations with people who are totally blind who say, I don't see skin color, and actually mean I don't see skin color because I can't see skin color. But I don't see skin color gets taken up in so many unhealthy and unfortunate ways that we can no longer be ism blind. The other thing I think I'll briefly touch on before I pass this back to Ainsley is the gatekeeper function, which arises really from an attitude on the part of educators that the student ultimately is not capable or not fit to carry out the essential functions of the jobs in the student's chosen field, in the sciences. And so this excludes people with disabilities from studying the sciences, right? You can't use a microscope, you shouldn't do biology. You can't hold a pipette, you shouldn't do chemistry. You can't put a circuit together, you shouldn't do physics, right? You can't look at you can't look through a telescope, you shouldn't do astronomy. And of course, we all know that nobody needs to look through a telescope anymore to do astronomy. So often this sort of belief in this lack of fitness, it's grounded in, yeah, I know the field, but it's not grounded in an equivalent, I understand accessibility. And likewise, if you have an itinerant teacher, a special ed teacher, or a university accessibility office, the challenge tends to be that they may know accessibility, but they may not know science. And so it's how you put these two things together. Ainsley?
So we're going to talk a little bit, we've talked a lot about the theory and the practice, and in theory we've all heard, of course, people with disabilities can do science, but in practice we all know that there is quite a number of barriers there for people with disabilities in science at all levels. And so really to spot this unconscious bias, people aren't going to say they have a bias. You're not going to hear it from them, but you are going to see it in their actions and some of the areas that we're going to talk about that follow. So there's two applications of unconscious bias in STEM around people with disabilities that we are going to illustrate here and talk a little bit more about. One of them is essential requirements, and the second one is how it shows up in the trainee-supervisor relationship. So the first one I want to talk about is essential requirements, and we need to understand what an essential requirement is before we can talk about it. Mahadeo? So an essential requirement of a course or a program, they actually refer to the skills or the knowledge or both that need to be acquired or demonstrated in order for students to successfully meet the learning objectives of that course or program and get the credit or whatever it is they're going to get from that study. And there's a few pieces of this that are really important. The first one is how a skill must be demonstrated. So do you actually have to look down a microscope to show that you're able to plan or evaluate an experiment? I would say no, but there's a lot of people who have unconscious bias and believe that, you know, you have to be able to perform an experiment in order to evaluate it and demonstrate other scientific skills inherent in being a scientist. And that is one way that unconscious bias shows up, is what you have to do in class in order to demonstrate your understanding of the material. When in fact, a student doesn't have to look down a microscope, they could have a description of what's under the microscope, and that would allow them to apply the skills that they need to demonstrate. So unconscious bias also shows up in essential requirements in the actual listing of competencies, those skills and knowledge that are listed that a student needs to know. But also sometimes it's important to note that it also shows up in what expectations are hidden or not made explicit that students need to know from a course. And this is around unconscious bias about how people learn and how people interact and communicate information. And disability really essentially impacts those things. And so when people talk about what it means to be a professional, for example, in many of the regulatory health sciences professions, or engineering, for example, is another regulated profession, they're not actually saying that students need to demonstrate specific behaviors to be considered professional. And those behaviors, you know, if you're blind or you're not hearing or you're neurodiverse can be really difficult to pick up on if they're not explicitly stated somewhere. And so unconscious bias or unessential requirements shows up in those three areas. So we talked about a little bit the hidden curriculum. So that's just another word for all those competencies that people assume students are going to just pick up by osmosis. So it's all the expectations, the essential requirements we want students to know, and we expect students to know where they learn, but we don't actually teach them those skills, and we don't actually identify those skills on a syllabus or as skills they need to learn, and that can cause conflict and barriers when students with disabilities need accommodations. And importantly, those hidden skills are often drivers of success in many STEM fields. Mahadeo?
So let's actually switch that now, because the conversation around essential requirements applies K to 12, college, university, undergrad, grad. And let's talk about something that's kind of specific to the research environment, or something perhaps specific to the practicum placement or the co-op placement or the work integrated learning environment in STEM, and that's the trainee supervisor dynamic. The supervisor in the context of STEM is somebody who of the trainee in the profession. So Ainsley is my supervisor, I'm the trainee, and Ainsley's role is to help me become integrated into the profession, to socialize me into the profession. But there can be attitudinal barriers associated with that, because if I'm a student with a disability, which I am, I have a visual impairment, and Ainsley is my supervisor, but Ainsley's not comfortable with students with visual impairments, then she's not necessarily going to socialize me into the profession the way she might another student. And that would mean she wouldn't necessarily write me a recommendation letter for a program. She wouldn't necessarily introduce me to her colleagues and her scientific friends, and you know, things that basically mean that I get isolated within the space. Not that Ainsley would actually do that, because we work together really well, but just as an example. And so there's also sort of the supervisor knowledge around that interface that Ainsley was just talking about between accessibility and essential requirements or learning objectives. And the more that a supervisor knows, the better off that they are in navigating this space with a student. But the less that they know, and the more that they don't want to find out, the more that becomes a barrier. There's also the supervisor's willingness to participate in conversations around accessibility and inclusion. Again, that has to do with conversations around the totality of us as people. It has to do with conversations around disability and accessibility generally, and how willing is someone to engage in those dialogues. And there's also how all of this relates to the appropriate clarification of expectations. And so both the student and the supervisor can bring unconscious biases in the form of attitudinal barriers to the table in the relationship, by having perspectives that we've talked about, and these can play out in terms of trust, and these can play out in terms of what are the right expectations, and who's expecting what of whom, and how's that going to get navigated. There's also something that shows up in this space that's a very big deal, that we call boundary issues. And basically this comes up in a setting where somebody has some level of experience, and it could be clinical in the healthcare setting, but it could also be engineering, or it could be theoretical. And somebody says, you know, I have experience with diversity and disability, and my experience with diversity and disability, even though I'm white, heterosexual, able-bodied male, for example, that experience that I have that is theoretical or clinical is the equivalent of understanding your lived experience, right? Or the student might actually think the same thing, that the theory or the clinical experience is going to be the same as the lived experience. And so this is where a faculty member might say, I understand because I can study, I understand because I treat, I understand because I research. This is also where a student might say, you will understand because you study, you will understand because you treat, you will understand because you research. And often these assumptions are assumptions that will actually lead to some serious potential challenges. So what do we do about bias? We ask why 5 times in challenging a course expectation. It's really important to get at what is the real reason behind this learning objective. And the more we ask why, the more likely we are to get to that. We address biases by making hidden curriculum expectations explicit, by calling out the things that we expect students to learn by osmosis, including osmosis. And we expect change to be slow. We work to stay in the game for the long haul. That's really important. We also need to help others understand that unconscious bias is expected. It's normal, as much as I don't like that word. And it's important then to recognize that everybody has it, and it's okay to share your own biases. And it's really important to upfront define expectations in relationship with supervisors and to practice self-care. I think it's a true statement to expect a lot of resistance from people when addressing unconscious biases. Ainsley, did you want to say anything else about the slide before we move on and wrap up?
No, I think that's a great summary of the slide, and we have a bit of time for comments and interaction.
And of course, our contact information. So if folks want to be in touch, our email is info@idea-stem.ca, and website is www.idea-stem.ca. And you can find a lot of the source matter and theory behind some of this in creating a culture of accessibility in the sciences. So thank you very much for listening to Ainsley and I, and we've got I think about 8 minutes or so to interact and have a good discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for that fantastic talk. We do have a few questions here for you. First up is from Adrian, who asks, does your work also consider fixed versus growth mindsets? There seem to be parallels there.
Thank you, Adrian, for that question. It's Ainsley speaking. That is an excellent question. I myself have done a lot of reading on the growth and fixed mindsets by Dr. Carol Dweck, I believe, and I see a lot of parallels as well. And I think there's, especially in the regulatory professions, but also in STEM generally, there is a lot of pressure for students to know stuff. People mark stuff up with red pen, and it sort of feels really uncomfortable if you don't have the right answer right away, or if you don't know something, or you're not confident about something that you know. And I think we need to be really good about being comfortable with making mistakes and recognizing that we're going to make mistakes, and getting to an understanding that allows more people to access opportunities in STEM, and sort of counters those negative unconscious biases that facilitate discrimination and other acts that are exclusionary. So I do think there's some significant links between the two. Mahadeo, I'm not sure if you had any comments on that.
I think the other thing that I might say is that there are absolutely significant links, there's significant parallels, and there's also significant causative relationship, because unconscious biases could lead, for example, to a conversion of a growth mindset to a fixed mindset. And I think it's really important to also reflect on the impact that biases may have on whether we think we can do something or can succeed at something.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. We have another question here for you from Lisa, who says, there has been a 50% drop in student enrollment with colleges in the US due to the uncertainty of the pandemic. Many students are now being homeschooled and exercising programs offered for free through STEM/STEAM initiatives. Do you have any recommendations for the parents, students, individuals pivoting career paths who learn STEM/STEAM with hands-on experiences with fieldwork such as citizen science, as opposed to with faculty and professors from academia?
So I'm gonna take a crack at this one first. I think it's a great question, Lisa, and I think it speaks to really the absolute importance of the kinds of things that are being done through SciAccess and other efforts like SciAccess, because now we're not just talking about science in the classroom. We're talking about science in the world. We're talking about science that's done by citizen scientists. We're talking about science that's done through science outreach organizations, and we're even talking about science that's done by parents in their kitchen, right? And how to actually manage kind of those conversations. And at this point, I might go out on a limb and say that there's a lot of untapped potential there. There is potential for barriers just because people don't know what they don't know, and we don't know how to do stuff in that space necessarily as well. But there's also lots of potential for opportunity, right? And I think this is where organizations like SciAccess and organizations like Idea STEM and C3D and a bunch of the others of us who play in the space, you know, it's worth it for us to actually figure out together how to answer Lisa's question in a systematic way, right? Because it might mean that that it's good to have outreach activities. It might mean that there's a little bit of coaching on what's it mean to think about when we're teaching science in a citizen science or a home school setting. What does that actually look like, and what does that actually feel like? So lots of opportunity, no specific recommendation, only to say I think there's room for us all to work together in this space. Ainsley, did you want to add anything?
I think for me, it comes back to defining those learning expectations, and you can achieve learning on STEM concepts and ways of thinking and doing STEM in very different ways. And if you know the goal of what it is you want the students to learn or experience, then you can figure out a variety of ways to make that happen.
Great. Thank you so much. We have another question for you from Allison, who asks, are there any best practices you can share for making hidden expectations explicit on a syllabus or within course expectations?
Mahadeo, can I take this one?
Yes, please.
I'm going to be brief because I know we're coming to the end of the time we have question and answers, and I see a few more popping up here. I think it's really important in course design to figure out the expectations ahead of time that you want the students to know, and then design your assessment and evaluation practices. But that's not always done in practice. And one of the recommendations, one of the ways to find out if you actually have hidden expectations, is to look at your assessment and your evaluation instruments and all the questions and all the exercises on those, and actually see if they link to your expectations overall in the syllabus that are presented to students at the beginning of a course of study, and make sure that there is a link there. And if there's stuff in your assessments and evaluation that's not in your course expectations or that's not explicit, then you need to either take it out of your assessment or put it in your course expectations. And one of the areas we talked a little bit about, you know, what it means to be a professional and some of those behaviors and the way people talk. That is certainly communicate. And that's certainly a hidden expectation from many programs. But one of the other big areas is around writing and how students learn to write scientifically, and the expectations from moving from, you know, being an undergraduate to research writing, which is very different than writing an essay or a research paper. And so all of the expectations about how students learn writing and what types of writing they produce and how much practice they should have before they're able to produce a good piece of writing are all good areas to explore around hidden curriculum.
Excellent, thank you. And we have time for one final question here from Aaron, who asks, have you found a relationship between unconscious bias and instructors who are considering and or centering when they design their course? I'm going to read that one more time. Have you found a relationship between unconscious bias and instructors who are considering and or centering when they design their course? And how do you help instructors broaden their ideas of who are the students they should plan for in their courses?
So it's Mahadeo. I'm going to take a crack at this one, if that's okay, Ainsley. The majority of instructors are centering and kind of they're taking as normative what Eurocentric.
Mahadeo, we lost you for a moment. Your sound just cut out for us. Ainsley, maybe perhaps
centering. If Ainsley,
oh, you're back. We can hear you again. We lost you for the last 10 seconds, but we can hear you now.
Okay, I think that's actually because my internet connection is unstable. I'll disconnect my video. So instructors center kind of white, able-bodied, Eurocentric, heterosexual, cisgender male. The unconscious bias is that's who I'm teaching science to. And so the need is let's put it in the minds of instructors that that we're really thinking about students with a diverse array of learning needs. Not everyone has the same cultural background. I didn't know what hockey was before I came to Canada. And so you couldn't teach me friction using hockey as an example. It just wouldn't have worked, right? Had nothing to do with sight loss and everything to do with the fact that I was born in South America, right? But people don't necessarily think about that. We don't think about other ways to teach probability other than using a deck of cards, but people may not see a deck of cards. We don't think about teaching the Doppler effect other than using a train or an ambulance siren. But what about people who are congenitally deaf, who've never heard these things? And I leave that as an exercise to all of you. How do you teach the Doppler effect if you don't use an ambulance siren? And when Ainsley and I are back tomorrow, anyone who wants to give us an answer can try. And so I think it comes down to teach to multiple learning needs. And it's not an accessibility conversation. It's a recognition that everybody has different learning needs. And if we can acknowledge that everybody has different learning needs, then we can start to teach to that, as opposed to sort of this very Eurocentric kind of way of learning and thinking that's been embedded in our classrooms.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. And I'm glad you mentioned, so Mahadeo and Ainsley will have a second session tomorrow at 11:10 a.m. So you can tune in again tomorrow to hear more. So thank you both so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.